Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and Tanya. Welcome, and in particular, welcome to our two presenters this morning, Shan and Marion. I'll just briefly introduce them. They're going to be talking around, obviously, the area that's of great interest to them, and relates to Shan's work very much in the digital sustainability area. So, Shan is Scientia Professor and Deputy Head of School at the School of Information Systems and Technology Management in the Business School. He is the founding director of the Digital Sustainability Knowledge Hub, and that's specialised in research on digital sustainability, but with the aim of contributing to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. His research interests include digital technologies, enabling roles in sustainability and climate resilience, focusing on the architecture, engineering, construction and agriculture sectors. Marion, her research interests lie in the role of digital technology in addressing specifically climate change, with a particular focus on developing countries, and the focus of today's talk is around that. She's also passionate about data analytics, and you should be, and AI, the social good, and how digital solutions can include minority groups. She's held over a decade of industry experience prior to her venture into the academy. So without further ado, I'll let them get started. Thank you very much, and welcome, Shan and Marion.
Good morning. Really appreciate to see many of familiar faces from the business school and some of the new friends that I look forward to meeting from ICR here. I've been, I told Ben, I told David that this is a dangerous thing to do, to come into the real experts territory to be using the word climate. But instead of, really telling people what I did, I thought it's a good reflection of our journey. I wanted to really come from the perspective of how would somebody who's trying to do interdisciplinary work, so me from the information systems school, and in one of our bullets, we mentioned that climate and sustainability are the least studied in information systems discipline. And I said that with a lot of confidence, including, a couple of my papers are finding it hard to publish them. So it is a real thing. But I think apart from that, we'll share the whole journey of how we sort of, set ourselves up and frame, be able to frame a study that we thought might be of value to both sides, both the climate research side as well as the business school, business research in general. The title is Leveraging Historical Data for Climate Projection in Vietnam. So this has a specific focus on Vietnam, and I'll tell the story. So I think last year, a couple of years ago, Ben and David, I had the privilege and the opportunity to think about climate research. David said, we started the Digital Sustainability Research group, but we haven't really touched on climate itself. Although climate is part of the sustainability equations there. But so I was reading around, so I came across the conversation article, and on surface it says climate change in Vietnam impacts and adaptation. That's a really harmless kind of title. You expect this kind of title in most of these articles. But when I read the paper, a couple of points sort of came out, and this is to someone who's not doing climate research on a daily basis. So it talked about, for example, it says that one is particularly interesting in Vietnam climate history is the early emergence of political structures that sort of echo the constant need to adapt and control natural events. So that was a very powerful statement. So when I imagine climate research, I'm thinking of the scientists working on big data, looking at plus data, but there's a history mentioned. There's a mention of history. There's also a mention of political structures. So how is political structures related to the climate science, if you were? And the other bullet that came out, the article was that if the climate issue was not the same as it is today, meaning that the old issues, there were already political responses we can actually learn about today and going forward. So there is that reference between what we can learn from history. Again, very strong for me. Prior to this, I looked at climate research as something that is purely scientific, right? Very scientific, rigorous, something that you need to have PhDs and very strong in statistics and so on to be able to handle that kind of research. So that got me interested. That's where the exploration really began for me. So I looked up in the literature, in our literature, information systems literature, and not too surprising to me. We found that I actually found that there are very few studies, and there were literature as recent as 2023 that talked about how little these two issues were addressed in information system research, and even more so for data science kind of research. A quick 30 seconds on what information system research is about for us. There's always the focus of technology. So we're looking at the use of technology or the impact of technology on anything, on X, on Y, on society, on business performance. So that's how we differentiate our work from the traditional management type of research. So for management research, you need not have the technology as the focal point. But for information systems, this is always a starting point. So it could be AI, it could be data analytics, it could be blockchain. So the use of blockchain for traceability, food traceability, right? The use of AI for education, the use of data analytics for climate research. So that's what really information system is about. So then I thought maybe there is an opportunity for us to study how data analytics, the role of it, can be applied to studying, right, climate-related challenges, including projection, including change kind of issues. So I thought that was a good starting point. Then I dig further, and I started to read literature outside information systems. So obviously, very few information systems that looked at climate. And there was some peripheral stuff. There's some, and we're beginning to see. So so I was educated, right, about the complexity of climate data. So it's very complicated. Experts here would tell you that it's far more complicated that we can imagine. But what really struck me was this paper that talks about every data set has a story. Right? That's when I sort of link link to those two bullets was read out. And then how data was, for example, there's always that mention of the context, the historical context, the time, 1997, the flood, the biggest flood in 1997. There's always that mention of physical space, right? When we talk about climate data, there's also time reference. And if you're throwing a little bit of social political issues there, you see those are also captured, right? And so that got me really interested. Then I continued to read on. I came across the need for local climate projection. So we're seeing a lot of global climate studies. It's all good, right? It's a lot of predictions about what it will be like in 20 years, in 50 years time. But local impacts are what is needed, right? It's okay to be worrying about what's going to happen to the global world. But I think in a lot of places, a lot of countries, people are more worried about their livelihood, right? Their properties and their lives, and therefore local understanding of the climate becomes important. And in their lingo, it's what it's called global downscale. So there's a need to downscale from a global set of data to a local set of data. So you could do this through statistical downscaling or dynamical downscaling. So that's what climate scientists do a lot. They downscale from global. So that was an interesting learning point there. Then I read on. Then I started to look for the role of history in climate research, in climate data. And so we're looking at bullets like, findings like historical data can play a vital role in producing climate knowledge. And so it's important to pay attention to historical data. So when it comes to climate history, so who writes climate history? So there are two communities. The first community are the hardcore scientists. So they are the ones that, based on their scientific data, their analysis, they write climate history. They look at last 100 years, they look at last 50 years, and so on. There's another group of people who write climate history, which is the historians, right? But the historians' work are less, publicized or less celebrated, especially in the last 10 years or so with this IPCC, with this global warming. It seems like the scientists are obviously taking the stage and explaining to the whole world. But historians do play a part, right? And even with some of the existing studies, they focus on applying statistical techniques in validating. So the keyword there is validating climate projection. But they're working with statistical tools in doing so, right? So these are the people who have done so, but they're still not the historians. They are the scientists doing that. So we sort of narrow it down to this kind of question that, so maybe we need to know a little bit more about how historical data were embodied in our knowledge, in our climate knowledge, and especially within specific contexts, and how they can be leveraged for climate projections. So I must say that this is a research in progress. So we're still working on this, but we thought we might have a study that looks at how historical data, when coupled with data analytics, can contribute to climate projections at a local level, and that could help facilitate risk assessment and the development of climate adaptation strategies. Right? So that's really, and our specific research question was, how can historical data, this is a working question, how can historical data be leveraged for climate projection? And for our kind of research, for management style or information system type research, we typically work with a theoretical, theory, and we call it theoretical lens, and we then use it to make sense of the phenomenon that we are studying and analyzing. So we thought imprinting perspective could be relevant. Very quickly on what imprinting is about. So imprinting, it's a process whereby an actor or group or entity develop characteristics that reflect the prominent features of their environment at that time. So imprinting, for example, and this happens a lot in politics, when people think of the era where Reagan, right? Ronald Reagan was the president. So they would talk about the imprints that Reagan as a president have left behind. And so imprint basically is a stamp. It's a time stamp, right? It's a stamp of the past, and that happens in a very short period, and often in a very sensitive period. So for example, we could have, 50 presidents in the last 100 years or last 150 years, but only few people have left imprints. And maybe because of the things they did, maybe because the era they were in, maybe because of the philosophy, the presidency and things like that, they would have left imprints, right? So imprints are pretty widely used in organizational literature to really explain the inference that historical conditions have on either individuals, organizations, or society or communities. So maybe you can slowly get what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to see how historical conditions from a climate point of view might have an impact on the society. In this case, climate protection. And, a few more points about imprinting. So imprint not only persists, so imprint can stay forever, but imprint can also change. It can be amplified, it can decay, right? It can sort of disappear into the history, so-called, and they can also transform. Imprints can also be transformed. Specific to our research, there are a couple of points there on the right-hand side that are important to us, and that is past imprints can coexist with present imprints. Right? So that's one area that, according to the literature, that is not very well studied. That more research is needed in the coexistence of past and present imprints. And the other point, the other thing that was important to us is the active role played by social actors. Right? In this case, could be the historians, it could be the modern scientists. And so, research-wise, there's a call for more work in understanding who play what role in developing and creating new imprint. Right, so those were a few important concepts that got us started. In other words, we began to see climate data as imprints. Climate data represent not only a physical space. Let's say, for example, this is the climate data set of Vietnam, right? Of Vietnam, of Australia, of any physical space, but it also captures the historical and also present conditions of that location, right? So it's got a lot of context behind, a lot of history, a lot of stories behind every data set. And the data set also bear imprints of social, economics, and political context. Later, Marian will share some of our empirical data, some of the data that we're collecting. It clearly captured not just the last 50 years, but in ancient history of Vietnamese social, political texts and so on, and how that social, economic, political context continue to influence the current climate science. So we are path dependent, right? We're not, so climate scientists obviously respect history. They draw on, the data sets over the last 50, 100 years and so on. And so imprints, the way we understand imprints will be that it will continue to have imprints. The literature says it could decay, it could be transformed, it could amplify. For example, in some of the colonized places, they will have a lot more imprints on climate data. And there are some examples in the case that would show that. In this case, Vietnam, like French were there, and they've left a lot of imprints on how the climate data was collected, analyzed, and how they were archived and so on. But not in the case of other nearby countries. The focus that we had was ASEAN in that region, and quite a number of colonized countries had that sort of history. So to bring everything together, I think you can understand this is a very model to help us understand what we're trying to do here. This would be an imprinting study of how climate historians, collaborate with data scientists to develop climate modeling and prediction. So it's a very simple research objective. We wanted to see how they come together. Remember, we were looking for coexistence of past imprints and present imprints coexisted. The past imprints were represented by the historians working on historical climate data, and the present imprints obviously will come from their work on using modern data analytics, and how they come together. So our study is a behind the scene kind of a case study that looks at how they work together, and theoretically speaking, it sort of address the interplay of the past and present imprints, which is one area that is not very well studied in the imprinting literature. And together, right? They form the basis of future climate projections. So that's really, yes.
Wait, I just have a question on definitions about imprints. So imprint is what leaves a mark, right? Mm-hmm. So how can you know that there is present imprint? How can you know that something is going to leave a mark? Do you make assumptions on it, or what's the method behind it?
Yeah, that's coming out in the explanation. Yeah, so basically, you know, imprinting is the process. Right? It's the process of either an actor or a group of people or organization develop characteristics. So imprints are created, right? That created, say for example, Reagan's presidency, right? So he obviously and his team have created legacies and things that they did, and those were characteristics of his presidency, right? And those characteristics would reflect, right, some of the features of the environment at that time in his presidency, for example. So that's what imprinting, but more. Yeah. Okay. I will then pass on to Marian to take us through. So quick 30 seconds on the background. So I then contacted the team. That wrote their article, and then I first flew to Hanoi with the Vietnamese scientists, and then I learned that they were working in a big group as a team, and they had economists, very much like ICR today, multidisciplinary. They have economists, they have behavioral experts, they have historians. So we've been talking to the historians, we've been talking to the economists, and then obviously the climate scientists who were doing a lot of the translational work, right? But some of the more exciting stuff, Marian, I'll pass it on to you to walk us through.
All right, thank you. So I will basically take you through the research method that we followed in terms of answering that research question and the story, the case study itself, and wrap it up with the findings. So given the exploratory nature of our research question, we decided to undertake particularly a case study approach because we will be then able to explore it from the angles of the multiple actors involved and help us to get rich insights on the context of the case. And we also adopted the structured, pragmatic, situational approach in conducting our case study. So we've anonymized the name here as Future Climate Project. So this was a multidisciplinary initiative which was undertaken in 2018. And the main sponsors of the project was the French Development Agency and Monbro, the Department of Climate Change in Vietnam. And apart from these two main sponsors, there were 10 universities who came on board from both France as well as Vietnam. And it was really multidisciplinary because there were data scientists, historians, anthropologists, economists, statisticians. So it was a really true collaborative effort. So why this initiative was undertaken was to support Vietnam in implementing Paris Climate Agreement, and the focus was specifically on impacts and adaptation. So the aim of this project was to assess the socioeconomic impacts that an increase in global temperature from 1.5, 2, or 3 Celsius before the pre-industrial era would have on Vietnam and come up with adaptation strategies. So what made this case interesting is, if you look at Vietnam geographically, it's very complex. The country can be divided into 7 geographical areas. Despite this complexity, and as Prof. Pan said, that makes it climate analytics even more difficult, this was one of the very few projects which took that data rescue effort to retrieve that historical data of the past. And from an imprinting perspective, we thought the case qualifies to look at it from that way because there were few sensitive periods. So we picked up the political regimes because, as he said, in Vietnam, there was an imprint which persisted over the years that there is a human-climate reciprocal relationship. people in the past in dynasty period thought climate changes were signals from God, showing the agreement of the political regimes. And then came the French colonial period, where the meteorological stations were established. It was more scientific. And then there was a prolonged war, and that had an impact on climate data in terms of reporting and monitoring, and then the present government. So we thought those would be the sensitive periods. And from a data science perspective, this was truly a classic example of data analytics for impact, where they were not being opportunistic of the existing data which is available, but multiple disciplines came into really retrieve that data and put a lot of effort in terms of developing the data set. So a bit of a background about the project structure. So there was an institutional committee and there was a scientific committee. And the scientific committee had 7 work packages. So the first work package, which was Climator, was to develop the probabilistic projections of the climate variables. And then you had a second work package, which looked at the sectorial economic impact. The third work package looked at the social impacts on the variables I mentioned there. And if you look at Vietnam, that is one of the countries which is heavily affected by climate change. And there are specific regions which are more sensitive, like the Mekong Delta. So the fourth work package specifically looked at these regions, and they attempted to come up with adaptation strategies. And the fifth work package was macro, where the economists and the statisticians were in play to see what is the macroeconomic impact in terms of GDP, in terms of unemployment, in terms of exchange rates. And the sixth work package, Adapto, was where anthropologists mainly contributed to understand the perceptions of Vietnam community on climate change and mobilizing those informal networks. So the seventh work package was really looking at the outputs produced by all these work packages, and their focus was in terms of translating this into policy dialogues through policy briefs, workshops, conferences likewise. So the aim of the focus of our case study was actually the first work package, which developed this historical climate data set, and that became an input for all the other work packages. So Climator was a collaboration between historians and data scientists. And that is where we saw the integration of historical climate data and using it for climate projections. So their aim was to develop a long-term climate data series of the past and a probabilistic set of climate scenarios of high resolution up to 2099. So why weren't they being opportunistic and really took this effort in digging down historical data? So when we spoke to the lead data scientist, what he said was, we understand how the climate signals have changed during the past 50 years, but we know that there's data existing much before that, and no one has used this data. So we thought if we actually retrieve this data, it'll help us to understand the longer term climate signals. So our primary data collections were through interviews. We were able to speak to the principal investigator and economist who had the responsibility of making sure this project is executed. And we also spoke to the lead historian from France. And we also had an interview with another Vietnamese historian. His focus was on the imperial periods and the pre-modern Vietnam. And the data scientist team had a lead scientist and 5 data scientists. So we had about 2 interviews with each of them. And the beauty is there was one data scientist who had used historical data in Vietnam for climate extremes. So she had a good understanding on the archival records and all that. And that understanding was really good to collaborate with the lead French historian. The secondary data, as I said, there was a lot of policy reports, project reports, workshops. The online workshops are available, so we went through all that to get a deeper understanding on the project. And just with like any case study, we derived our first order concepts from the interviews, then the second order themes and aggregate dimensions. So this is a small extract of that. Right, so I'll now move on to the story. So what is the process that we saw? So we saw there was 3 phases of historians collaborating with data scientists. So the first phase was the historians performing the climate history inquiry. And the second phase was where historians and the data scientists came together in terms of data evaluation. And the third one was where data scientists performed climate modeling and prediction. So I'll quickly take you through each of these steps to give an understanding. Right. So when the historians had been approached to undertake this task, what they said was they had 2 objectives. One is to develop an overview of the climate history in Vietnam. But say you have developed an overview of climate history in Vietnam, but what's the relevance for this project? It will only be relevant if the historical data, that historical overview, can address the contemporary climate challenge. So how do we go about that? So those were the 2 main objectives. So to develop that climate history overview of Vietnam, they organized a webinar series. So if you go to this website, you can go through that webinar series. And that brought a lot of people together, the French historians, Vietnamese historians, PhD students who were studying on Vietnam. And that really motivated and encouraged a dialogue around that. So they came up with 4 approaches of looking at climate history. The first one is looking at the history to reconstitute what the past climates look like. So what was the temperature, right? The second one was to see how the climate has influence on the evolution of societies. This was important because in Vietnam, they saw when there were climate calamities that brought about social uprising, and some of the dynasties was thrown out. So the implication of that would be that climate change can bring about political instability and social uprising. So that was another approach of looking at that. And the third one was on the cultural representations of climate. How do people interpret these climate challenges, the interpretations of the cosmos and a worldview? And the fourth one was to understand from the past how people responded to climate changes, and then see what are the implications of that in terms of coming up with adaptation strategies. So this was the conclusion of the 4 approaches. So then they undertook their journey on the first one, which is to reconstitute past climates according to the historical climate records. Now, as I said, there were several periods in Vietnam. So can you depend on all these historical records? Okay. So starting off from the imperial period, the court reports, the dynasty chronicles were really important source of information. Because, as I said, people thought the emperor was the main person who had the ability to communicate with gods. And all the climate changes, climate itself was meticulously reported. It was very detailed, which day, which province, what time, what happened. But going through those chronicles, there were also instances where, for an example, if a new dynasty comes into power, the river was turning crystal clear, or the Mekong Delta turns red, or mountains depart, and then, ruler's mother passed away. So basically, then they understood that these records were also used to illustrate political messages to the community. But having said that, as I said, there were lots of records available. And if you look at the third picture, it was an important source of information, a book on the complete history, which reports all the natural incidents as back as, 1400s. But the conclusion was one has to be really careful about thinking about these records from a scientific point of view. Then came the French colonial period. And it was interesting because the colonies were developing meteorological networks in colonized countries, like, say, for an example, India. So there was pressure from colonies to the French asking for their climate data as well, right? So that colonial meteorological network started emerging during this period, and the French also took measures to develop the observation network. And this was for different purposes. Initially, it was for agriculture. As you can see, some of the meteorological stations were actually placed at agricultural plantations. And then for typhoon prevention, then for aviation. So there were different purposes. And also the data was publicly published during that period. So the conclusion was, imperial times, it's not reasonable to use this data, but when it comes to the period since French colonialization, it's relevant to contemporary climate science. So then the next step was in terms of retrieving that data. So they then undertook that challenging task because, as I said, there were a lot of countries, I mean, there were few countries who were occupying Vietnam. So some of the archives were in Vietnam, some were in France, some were in Japan. So then they had to sort of like do like a police inquiry, talking to people, because visiting the National Archives wasn't enough. So they took really effort in terms of retrieving the data during this period. And those were captured in digital format, organized and shared with the climate data scientists. Now, something which they considered equally important was to reconstitute the context of climate data production as much as possible. Because initially, the historians were really motivated saying, this historical data, we know it can be useful because of big data analytics. But the data scientists said, well, the models can't evaluate all this data. Right? It's not possible. So because of that, the historians really understood, and it's the historian who said, we can have bad data in a model and have a bad conclusion, and that's why it's important to understand the context of the data. Also because historical data can be used for many purposes. It's not only in terms of validating climate projections, it can be with coming up for indexes on climate extreme events. So what he said was, if I have this context documented, any contemporary scientist can go through this and understand whether the data serves their purpose. So after that came the phase of evaluating the data. So once the data was passed to the data scientists, they digitized it in a machine-readable format, and they respected the original documents. They digitized as it is, because then that helps them to evaluate the biases. And before going on to analytics, they had that interdisciplinary knowledge exchange, understanding from the historians for what purpose was the data recorded, and even going to the extent of understanding what were the principles governing climate monitoring and recording during that period, what sort of instruments were there, like calibration, and going on to that extent. And it's really important, literature says it's really important to understand this context for data scientists, because it helps them to guide their whole investigation, but also on the other hand, it helps them to evaluate biases, and any projection would have biases. So it helps them to sort of like evaluate the impact of those biases on results and make appropriate recommendations. Then there was detailed quality evaluation. So as the first step, because Vietnam is also subjected to multiple climatic cycles like El Ninos and La Ninas. So so they basically evaluated whether those cycles were reflected, and if there was reanalysis data sets, that's like past data sets which is available, they compared against that, and then they went on to detailed statistical evaluations using computerized models. And as I said, you can't manually check millions of data like that, so you need to have a program to do it. Right. And then the final step Well, so you have those data which is evaluated, but if the data is to be useful, you need to change it to a gridded data set, data which is continuous in time and space. So for that, this is a bit technical. So for that, what they performed assimilation techniques. So it's a sequential process where you get the existing data, add on these new observational data, see how it performs. So it's a sequential process. And then once you have that graded observation data set, that was validated. Again, a bit technical, but this is an important step to see how well or how superior this new knowledge is compared with the existing. And that is important to see the usefulness of the data set. Right, so where does it link to climate projections? Now, Prof. Pan, in his introduction, touched upon global climate models. For an example, IPCC comes up with global climate models. But it has limitations because it's of low resolutions. There's limitations in terms of using those climate models for local decision making. So there's this process called downscaling, which is happening to make it high resolution. And for that, you need to have a good reference data set. So that is where this data set came into play. And it was used to validate the downscale outputs of 35 global climate models from this latest CMIP 6 global data set. So this was the final outcome of this task. So they came up with the first complete high resolution temperature and precipitation data set for Vietnam. So there are different scenarios in those global climate models, which is shown from different lines. And the data set goes up to projections to 2100. So this data was then used by all the other work packages in terms of evaluating those economic impacts and likewise. And another thing which was considered important is documenting, again, the context of the data production. That was also given a lot of importance. Right, so that brings to the end of my story on how the historians and the data scientists collaborated to come up with this output. Now I will move on to the preliminary findings. So as Prof. Pan said, we looked at it from an imprinting perspective. So if you look at the imprinting frameworks, first, it's important for us to understand the imprint genesis or the origins of this imprint. So as the lead historian said, before the 20th century, before modern science came into place, people thought they had influence on climate. And you have papers on this ritual calling for rain and wind, where the emperor used to have rituals asking for favorable climatic conditions. Now, since then, still that reciprocal human-climate relationship is there, because thanks to modern science, we now know our actions do have an impact on climate. So that has not changed, although the form would have changed, but that crux of that matter still remains. So in terms of the imprint origin, the first point is to understand who were the imprinters, what were the sources which gave templates, or what are the sources which form these climate data imprints, because we are really looking at climate data here. So we identified that the cultural beliefs, because Vietnam is strongly rooted in Confucian beliefs, and their beliefs that the relationship between gods in heaven and the rulers on earth, that had like that had implications on the political regimes. So we identified cultural beliefs and political ideologies as imprinters. And even moving on from dynasty period, because if you look at colonialization, whether it was agriculture or typhoon prevention, even where the observations stations are, that was governed by the ruling regimes, right? And then the imprinted entity here is the Vietnam community, and the sensitive periods were the regimes, as I already discussed before. So that basically had an imprint on the historical climate data. And now we are going through another sensitive period. Vietnam is going through another sensitive period on the climate change. And if you recall that conversation article, the emergence of the political structures on responding to these changes still persist. And here, what we're considering is that the present imprint is also coming from climate analytics, right? And the imprint synthesis process, what it actually does is leveraging on these past imprints, but refining it based on the present understanding. So that's what the historians and the data scientists did. So we identified 5 steps here. First is historical inquiry. Because any unit of analysis, before you refine the existing imprints, there's literature which says it's really important to understand what happened in the past, what sort of led towards that imprint formation. And second one was contextualization, where you understand that imprint in light of that context. Third one was evaluation, where you understand the different biases associated with it. And fourth one is where you integrate the previous understanding with the present one, right? In our case, it was coming from the historical data and the present knowledge. And then you validate to assess whether the new understanding is superior than what I had in the past, and finally disseminate it. So in this case, yes, they developed a projection up to 2100, and there's literature saying how climate data tends to persist in the society. So until, another version comes into play. And we really looked at how the social actors, in this case, the historians and the climate data scientists were the social actors who engaged in terms of refining that imprint. And the final output, we call it a synthesized imprint, right? A synthesized imprint means an imprint which is, again, leveraging on the past, but refining based on the present. And that basically is how we are planning to, in terms of responding to our question on how historical data can be leveraged for climate projection. The contributions that we are...
Bear in mind time.
Yeah, the contributions that we are intending is the theoretical contribution is in terms of big data analysis research for climate projections, how historical data can be leveraged for modern science, and then contributing to imprinting theory, where we theorize the imprint synthesis process, how the past and the present interplay can come together. The practical contribution would be to see how the usefulness of global climate models can be enhanced, because this is an issue especially for developing countries, the lack of downscale climate projections. And also in terms of data science, how high-impact data science initiatives are undertaken via multidisciplinary collaborations. And that brings to the end of our presentation. Thank you, everyone.
So, up to the questions. Sure.
Thank you both. I think this is great. And I have to say, I'm jealous because this is the kind of idea I wouldn't want to have like 5 years ago. So thank you very much for doing this. This is great.
You mean we're 5 years late?
Huh? 5 years ago, sorry. Sorry. This is great. Really. I loved it very much. I got a couple of questions. I didn't get it. So how long into the past are you looking with your records? Is it like the early 1900 or is it further back into the past?
So they did look into the past as back as dynasty records, but the actual usage came since the colonial period.
And the second question, do you think it will make sense to include books and novels as form of records? From, I don't know, because my background is Italian.
Okay.
And we had the Roman Empire, and they literally wrote about anything that happened every single day.
Yeah.
And you have written records dated back to the very ancient past. Okay. So I wonder maybe that would be an interesting addition to some sort of new sort of data we looked at. But I don't know what extent it's true for the Vietnamese.
Because yes, yeah.
No, thank you. This is great. I loved it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, the integration of different perspectives. I guess my question is, I can see how bringing together these different perspectives can contribute to the dissemination, the understanding of the impact of climate with that historical record for current people and the explanation of how the climate is changing. But the fourth step on your thing, the integration and validation, how will you know, how can you test the kind of difference between including those historical records in the ways that they're trying to do in this project versus not? Is it just in terms of the precision of the downscale model?
So a few things. For the climate data scientist, it was actually in terms of validating the model, because previously this data set was not available. So then they validated and checked how superior it is to the existing data sets. But in terms of the whole project, if I'm giving like a project perspective, it is the novel insights you get. For an example, Mekong Delta, all this time, the thinking was that the delta was sinking because of the sea levels rising and all that. But this project also highlighted it is not the case. It's also the human activities which contributes towards that. Or there's also other instances where where they identified even without lack of policy incentives, people would still adopt. But no, that's not sufficient. So in terms of the whole project, I think there was a lot to it, but our focus was really on the data analytics part of it. So in that case, it would be in terms of validating it.
I really liked your angle on the social construction of climate data. Obviously, you have your literatures identified already, but it did remind me of the work of Bruno Latour and all these sociologists around the social construction of scientific facts. Okay. And I was wondering, maybe that could be something to explore as well, and contrast also with the literatures you're looking into. Thanks, Bruno.
Thank you for the talk. So when you collected the data, the historical data, how did it look like? Was it gridded? Was it just like in different regions, you have different data like records? And then how did you use this data to actually build the downscaling model? You need like a complete coverage of the course and then build a mapper that gives you the high resolution and then apply it to the GCM.
Yeah. So the historians, when they collected the data, it was all over, but it was observation records. So what they did was so the data scientists basically entered it, and that is where, to make it like a grid, that is where the assimilation techniques were deployed.
And then from the course grid to the 10-kilometer grid.
Yes, so then what they did was they took the latest CMIP6 model, and then they did, I can't recall whether it's statistical downscaling or the dynamic downscaling, the advanced one of that, and used to validate that against this observational data set.
I think it's the latter.
Yeah, the dynamic one. Okay. Yeah.
We need to make a call to the data scientist.
Well, there's a paper
we are
that you
of their work.
can share it.
We are the actual data scientists. I think in this room there are people who can help us answer those questions.
This one actually just the study for downscale. Yes, we could read the CMIP6 data from the high resolution to lower, and from lower resolution to high resolution. Just article, and after that, they make something like statistical bias correction with the observational data to make them more look like the observation.
So after the downscaling was then the historical data that was collected by the historians used to validate
And that historical data set was also published as standalone so that anyone who wants to use it, because I know there's phase 2 of the project, which is really looking at coming up with indices for climate extremes. So yeah, it can be used for any purpose.
For those interested in some of the technicalities, the team actually published a few books.
Yeah.
There was a COP26 assessment of their Vietnam project, and you can look it up. It's called Climate Change in Vietnam: Impacts and Adaptation. So you can drop us an email. We can send you the references. It's a thick report on the whole process from historian, how historians went to work and to some of the more technical, climate scientists' work. So for those who are in that area specifically, I really encourage you to read it and help us make sense of some of the things that we might have gaps. Yeah.
And they'll be helpful. They're getting a lot of requests.
There are gaps in our interpretation.
We've got a minute, so I'll talk to you guys after.
Okay.
Andy, and I think there was someone else.
Oh, it was me, but I'll look up that report.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
So the data capture that the historians helped you with, I get that, really very useful. There's lots of work done on capturing otherwise lost data and digitize it and bring it into the pool. Really valuable stuff. And I can see how that might influence your statistical downscaling. Remembering that statistical downscaling doesn't tell you about future extremes. What I don't see is how the method modifies how you would do a projection. It's not true that you need data of the past to do projections. That's not how you do projections. But clearly you are wrapping that data into some form to inform your projections. Are you able to explain how you're doing that? Or do I need to go and read the paper?
I think it's a great question for us to find answers for.
And as a scientist, the critical question is that having done all this great work and having informed the downscaling and done this, does it make a material impact to the projection of the things that Vietnam is vulnerable to? And to what degree is that stationary? The whole point of climate projections is they don't reflect the future of the variability per se. They reflect how the variability is impacted by climate change, which can completely change a climate of a region. And I've never understood how historical data informs you about changes that aren't reflected in the historical data. So how is the data being used to inform the projections?
Okay.
We're about to kickstart our second round interview.
Yeah.
So your scientific questions are very welcome because I think there are a lot of gaps, including this one. It's amazing. So we might need to go back to the data scientists to ask them exactly this question. Does it make a material, right?
Difference to the, okay.
You reckon not much, right? I mean, that's...
I have no idea. I mean, at the scales you're working, you shouldn't be using the CMIT models. You should be using the Cordex models. Right. But that's still a 30-kilometer grid, which is 2 course.
Okay.
The question is, when you pull these data in, how does it influence? Does it influence the projections within the uncertainty bands of the Cordex models? Or if it moves the projections outside the uncertainty range of the Cordex models, that's really important. And understanding why is even more important. So it's absolutely cool what you're doing. I'm trying to understand the degree to which it makes a material difference to a decision about to be made on adaptation.
Yeah.
The transitioning, right? The bridging, the integrating. So from historians to data scientists work, that sort of transitioning. And how does that happen? And does it really matter? Okay, those are great questions.
Yeah.
You won't know if it matters until you do it.
Because when we
a good reason for doing it.
When we did our first round of discussion, we actually looked at Codex as well, and they were also coming up on Codex C project, which is for Southeast Asia, but that is still at preliminary stages. It hadn't advanced, and we didn't see this type of collaboration happening. So after that, we thought we'll focus on this project. But your point is taken. Yeah, I think that's something which we can go back and yeah.
So when you were talking about how you've put lots of effort to collect all the data from the historians, which I think it also includes the impact or things that happened in the past, maybe drought, maybe flood, maybe other things. I really thought that then later you will say that, well, and we built a model that can see, first we linked the climate recipe that is associated with those events, and then we built a model which then used it to see what will happen in the future.
Yeah. That's phase 2. That's
because
happening.
Because since you have that richness of data, I think it makes sense to then look at this.
That's the phase 2 of the project, which they're currently in.
Last question then.
It's not a question, it's a comment. Thank you very much for the presentation. But I've done a project a little bit closer to what you're doing, but yours was very extensive, and Prof. Shan know about that. This historic data is in fact very essential and vital if you want to build up like exactly your next stage of prediction. So you can build an AI model where you can integrate those kind of essential points of climate change that you can see the change later on and the projection that he was talking about exactly. So this is a very vital and essential stage. And the second stage could be like for predicting and see that kind of projection. So, yeah. Thank you.
I'll talk to you after.
Where to go?
It's a little bit confusing. So, have you guys done this modeling, or is this a study?
Yeah, we are researchers documenting how they did it.
Okay.
I wish we could. From the ancient historical reports to the data science. Yeah, but this is what ICR is saying. We would love to do an ICR project, and look at how you guys went to work. So,
Well, Shan, Marion, thank you very much. I think you tell by the questions, the level of engagement, how much people enjoyed that really innovative and interesting talk. Shan, I'm struck by the fact when we came to you, when we were establishing the ICRR, we talked about it being a multidisciplinary endeavour, and you were really enthused by that because it clearly coincides with your approach and interests. And I think that shines through today in the presentation you and Marion have given. So thank you very much, everyone.